Hello and welcome to Ellroy Reads. This is the show where every week I look at a book that was influential to James Ellroy. And in the world of James Ellroy, we've had some very exciting news this week. That is, James Ellroy's latest novel, Red Sheet, will be published in June 2026. We have a full synopsis available. Here it goes. Turn to the first page and disavow what you think you know. This is 1960s Los Angeles like you've never seen it before. In a daring work of historical fiction from best-selling author of The Enchanters and Widespread Panic. It's late October 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis has just concluded. The US prevailed. Attorney General Robert Kennedy faced reprisals from domestic Communist Party members embedded in LA. He orders a red probe and puts the LAPD on the job. Freddie Otash is named lead investigator. He encounters commie malfeasance at every turn. He homes in on a red front trade union. There's a murder on Halloween night. It links to ex-VP and gubernatorial candidate Richard Nixon, and possibly 2 homicides 8 years back. Now Freddie is working double duty. He's commanding the probe and is hired to keep Nixon out of trouble. Meanwhile, integrationist fever is sweeping LA, and the police department comes under its fire. Ex-cop lawyer Tom Bradley is running for city council and pushing the Rumford Fair Housing Act. Playboy kingpin Hugh Hefner is along for the ride, and the long-forgotten but still stunning folk singer Judy Hensk is on a collision course with the love of her life, the freewheeling Freddie O. The stage is set for chaos, and Freddie thrives on chaos. Red Sheet is a work of subversive art. It embodies indigenous American berserk with a uniquely crazed and brilliant passion. Okay, so this is exciting news for Ellroy fans. It hasn't actually been that long since The Enchanters. And there was a period in the early noughties where Ellroy was moving quite slowly. He's now, you might say, an old man in a hurry. He's publishing a book every 2 or 3 years. And this is actually the 4th book in what is now the Los Angeles Quintet, which began with Perfidia in This Storm, the 2 wartime set novels. And then Ellroy eventually abandoned the wartime setting. He abandoned the whole prequel concept. And he jumped forward to the early 1960s with The Enchanters and now Red Sheet. I was excited when I first saw the synopsis. What I immediately thought was that the title, Red Sheet, could be both police slang and also links to potential, tabloid journalism. And that's something that's very important to Ellroy. I mean, one of his greatest novels was called American Tabloid. In Britain, we call the tabloids red tops. Again, with the police slang, Red Ball is a high-profile police case in the US. One of Ellroy's novels, actually The Cold 6000, he originally had the provisional title Police Gazette, which is again linking to journalism. On a much more kind of smaller specialist scale, but, Hush Hush, LA Confidential, another, tabloid title. And speaking of which, just the whole release of this synopsis and title reminded me of a story which is in Love Me, Fierce and Danger. But I'm going to give you a little extra. Ellroy's longtime agent Nat Sobel and their relationship began to strain in the early noughties because Nat Sobel would release the titles of all his forthcoming clients on his website. And he released Police Gazette via his website for what turned out to be the Cold 6000. It sweeps the internet quickly. Ellroy is furious. It is not the title he intended. It was just one that he imagined, that he considered for a little while. And he has words with Nat Sobel. Sobel apologizes. He assures him that this is not going to happen again. Fast forward 15 years or so, and on Nat Sobel's website, before it becomes common knowledge, This Storm appears as Ellroy's next novel. And I was tipped off about it by a friend in Denver who's also very close to Ellroy. He watches the show. I'm not going to name him by name. I want to respect his privacy. So I wrote a piece from my website about This Storm and the symbolism behind the title. That piece, took off fast, internet style. And then when Ellroy and I's mutual friend in Denver next saw him at his monthly film screening, he showed him the title. He said, I saw something on Nat Sobel's website, This Storm. Ellroy was furious. He actually said that's not the title the novel's going to be, but that did turn out to be the title. Ellroy sacked Nat Sobel the following morning in a brief, curt 2-minute phone call. He got picked up by Andrew Wiley, became his next agent, and he's still his agent to this day. One of the things that Ellroy never found out was that I wrote the article that went on the internet and spread like wildfire. On the advice of friends, I swiftly deleted the article. So I always felt kind of guilty that I had an unwitting role in the dismissal of Nat Sobel. Anyway, this story, along with many others of Ellroy's life, is in Love Me, Fierce and Dangerous, so do treat yourself to a copy. And if this sort of content is your bag, hit that subscribe button, hit your like button, and you'll support the show and have all of the new episodes coming straight to your inbox. Okay, so enough of new news. Let's look at our book for this week, which is one of the all-time pill-popping classics, Valley of the Dolls by Jacqueline Susann. Okay, so Jacqueline Susann was born in Pennsylvania, raised in Philadelphia. Her initial ambition was to become an actress, and she moved to New York, and she had roles in television, and she had roles on stage to some limited success. Although she was voted the best dressed person on television numerous times. And that pretty much set the stage for the kind of glamour that was to be a calling card of her entire career. She began writing. She wrote, short pieces like a memoir from the point of view of a dog. And she wrote some plays, again to limited success. But she really hit the big time when she wrote this novel, Valley of the Dolls. And it concerns, it's an epic novel. It concerns the lives of 3 women over the course of 20 years. So from 1945 till the mid-60s. Straight after World War II, the 3 ambitious women, Anne, Neely, and Jennifer. And it's about their life in show business, pretty much from the start of their show business careers right down to, shall we say, the descent, because this is a rags to riches tale, and it's also a cautionary tale, because these women kind of experience the good life, fame, money, but there's a terrible cosmic cost to this. And the cost ultimately is that you descend into the valley of the dolls, and the dolls are actually pills. This is a novel about pill addiction. Barbiturates, Seconal, the dolls, they take red dolls, blue dolls, yellow dolls. This is a novel about the various forms of addiction and how they creep up on you. So you have sleep cures, drug alcohol cocktails, and not just addiction, but plastic surgery, and basically all manner of self-abuse. And for the first 200 pages, so the dolls don't come in, the pills don't come in until about halfway through the novel. For the first 200 pages, I was reading this and I was thinking, this is a very enjoyable, trashy melodrama. Because we follow Anne, who's this woman who has escaped her kind of stuffy, small-town village existence in Massachusetts and moved to New York. And she doesn't want to get married. And this is, quite radical stuff, like in the immediate post-war America. She's like, I could have married any boring man in Massachusetts, but I've come to New York because I want a career. And marriage is the death of a career back then, because marriage automatically entailed children, and that just pretty much took women out of the workforce for years, perhaps forever. And then she's a ballsy woman, and you really, really admire her. Then she falls for, shall we call him a slimy limey? A bit like me. No, she falls for an Englishman, an actor with writing ambitions called Leon Burke. I'm not quite sure. Lyon. I'm not quite sure how you're supposed to pronounce that, but and she's warned by women in the office. You cannot trust this guy. He's slept with everyone, and he's told her you're the one, and you're going to be the woman I marry and all of this. And of course, she's so swept up in his charm that she just ignores the warnings. And I feel like that's when I began to feel like the novel was, slightly more profound than its trashy reputation has suggested. Because you read this today, and because I think like certain aspects of psychology are much more in the public realm, we know about narcissistic personalities. We know about love bombing, and cutting people off without a word. We know that these are the traits of a narcissistic character much more now. I mean, maybe we learn through experience, and especially in show business where 1 minute you're hot and the next minute you're not, and you're just cut off without a word. So I did feel for her, and she was probably my favorite character of the trio. Although of course Neely is this, she's on her way to becoming a Broadway legend, singer and dancer. So her trajectory is great fun. And Jennifer is probably the most shallow character because it's kind of cruel in that, she's an actress with no discernible acting talent, but she has got just the most incredible figure. She becomes in the public realm and what her agents make her a kind of sex pot. And also, we can draw parallels with Marilyn Monroe, or even still, even today, the kind of actresses who fall that way. And once we get to the second half, and the pills enter, it becomes much darker, and I feel like much more profound, because people don't just become addicts. It's not like you see people growing up and you think, oh yeah, that person's bound to be a drug addict. It's more subtle than that. They start taking pills because they're recommended them, in show business, because it helps soothe their stage fright, and then because they can't sleep, so it helps cure their sleeplessness. But then they develop an immunity to them, so they have to take more and more. And suddenly they're knocked out for almost like a week at a time. And there are moments that fall into kind of camp classic here. There's a moment where one grand old dame has a wig pulled off and gets it flushed down the toilet, and she's stuck in the toilet. There's lots of people outside. She can't possibly come outside. And she's paid a fortune for this wig. And they have contributed to this book becoming a camp classic. But when I was reading Ellroy's biography, when I was writing Ellroy's biography, when I was researching it, actually, former addicts, members of Alcoholics Anonymous, where Ellroy had many friends, would say that, in our descent, before you hit rock bottom, because you have to hit rock bottom before you really get help, there are still many funny stories where we did wild stuff. And as long as it's one of those ones where people don't get too hurt, we can have a laugh about them. And Ellroy has only just begun to talk about this novel in the last few years and his love of it. He talks about it in the same breath in the way that he'll talk about, Harold Robbins, or, novelists like Robbins, or even James Jones, the mid-20th century novelists who wrote kind of epic door-stopping novels that were just mega sellers. And I think it's because he's beginning to reposition himself. He wants to be that sort of novelist. Now, whether he can in 2025, remains to be seen, because who writes Dan Brown, Richard Osman, they seem to be the ones who are writing like the mega sellers, and they're kind of like, they're not trashing melodramas in the same way. They seem to be more political conspiracy theorists. But maybe Ellroy kind of is the gateway drug, to use a drug metaphor, and bridges that gap. This novel was an absolute mega seller. First of all, it sold 6 million copies in its first 6 months, so over 1 million copies a month. It met, in the mid-60s, it met with awful reviews, but it went straight to New York Times best-selling list. And Jacqueline Susann's next 2 novels also met awful reviews but went straight to New York Times bestseller list. And this was the pattern. And she was the first novelist to have 3 successive novels on the New York Times bestseller list. Film adaptations were made of all 3. Again, terrible reviews for them, but they broke box office records. The film adaptation of Valley of the Dolls is actually a lot of camp fun. It's become a camp classic and it's kind of beloved in queer cinema. Jennifer is played by Sharon Tate, which is very good casting because she was perhaps the most beautiful woman of her time, and it's absolutely tragic how her life was robbed from her. So, yeah, let's finish with some stories about Ellroy's own struggles with addiction, okay? Because I'm sure that, part of his connection to this book is because he struggled with addiction himself. And, you will find that this book is, like I said, very, very realistic. So Ellroy, as we know, after his mother died and then 7 years later his father died, Ellroy was just about a legal orphan, but right on the cusp of adulthood. But like he'd already sunk quite far. He'd been expelled, and he was drifted from one job to another. But he was drifting in and out of homelessness and in and out of jail, and he was abusing alcohol and he was abusing drugs as well. He tried LSD, but he said it left me cold. His drug of choice were Benzodiazepine inhalers, because there were a lot of drugs back then, before the pharmaceutical market became very regulated. They could just get over the counter, drugs like speed. So Benzodiazepine inhalers, you could inhale them several at a time and get a real rush. Then Ellroy nearly died of pneumonia, and he feels that his life has been spared. He's a very religious man, and he vows to get clean. And he did get clean, but he continued to abuse drugs. Well, he continued to smoke marijuana for a while, which he said was good but not great. And he described it as trying to reach the moon in a Volkswagen. Then his friend Randy Weiss said, I'm going full sobriety, no marijuana either. And after some hesitation, Ellroy embraced that too. They went to AA together. Ellroy met extraordinary people in Venice Beach AA. I'm not going to name them because obviously it's Alcoholics Anonymous. Some of them have spoken out about their troubles publicly. But let's just say Venice Beach AA in the late 1970s, just incredible creative people. Many people who had careers in show business and either, mid-career or were going to make it in show business, producers, directors, dancers, actors. And maybe we can say about this novel is that it broke the taboo in the link between show business and depression and addiction. So Ellroy, got clean and had many fond memories of AA. He said, it was pre-AIDS, and the thing about when you come off drugs is that your sex drive comes back, because drugs will rob you of your sex drive. It's a nice thing about getting clean is you're with all these other people who've just got sober, and you're in the mood for fun, and not just fun, but relationships as well. Because another thing about drug addiction is that you stop growing emotionally during your addiction. If you're addicted for 5 years, that 5 years in terms of emotional growth just isn't there. So you start to mature, and that gives you the opportunity to have relationships. Ellroy, was clean for many years, but he had 2 relapses. And his first encounter with pills came when, during the Cold 6000 publicity tour, which was grueling for him, Ellroy essentially had a nervous breakdown, and he fell into depression. And by this time he was married to Helen Canode, and she was very concerned about his health, and she managed to get him help. And part of that help entailed him taking antidepressants. He was prescribed. And she described it to me, the effect on his mood was miraculous. Within half an hour of taking some pills, he'd gone from barely getting out of bed, the lights off, the curtains are drawn, it's dark, to jumping on his exercise machine and he's blasting Tchaikovsky and he feels better than ever. He said the price of that is addiction. Because Ellroy has a very addictive personality. That's why he compulsively writes books. And that can be very dangerous when you get into substance abuse. So he was abusing pills for a while. He was, jumping from one medication to the next. I suppose he was substance shopping to a degree. He was getting medication under the counter, and he had to go into rehab for that. And he got clean again. And then several years later, by which time he was divorced from Helen, around the time Ellroy was burning through one affair after another, he began abusing drugs again, pharmaceuticals, and he was also drinking again, which really shocked Helen. She said, pills is one thing, but I never thought Ellroy would start drinking again. He was drinking, but I don't think whiskey, but like Budweiser, beer, which he thought was good first quenches, but he just put away one after another. Anyway, he got clean again. He went to the 180 Center, and he's been clean ever since. And, he takes his sobriety very seriously. And there've been, he doesn't judge anyone else who might want to drink, but there have been times at publishing parties and stuff where, shall we say, drunken, sometimes obnoxious authors have tried to push a drink in his hand. Derek Raymond did that once, and he just pushed them away. He'll be polite at first, but if he feels that you're being discourteous, he will get nasty. Anyway, when I was writing James Ellroy's biography, I spent a lot of time with him. We became very close. But I'd had this previous contact with him, which had been quite close in itself, not quite as intense, but close, around the time of 2008, 2009. We'd had phone conversations, which were great. And now looking back, I realize that was the time where he had his second relapse. All the time I was talking to him on the phone those times, and actually met him once at the Ravenswood where he was living at the time in LA. He was high, but lucid, intelligent, and still kind and generous. But, and Helen always said to me, I can never understand how, even at the height of addiction or the height of a mental breakdown, Ellroy is still making publishing deals, still hitting screenwriting deadlines, still getting the books in. I could never fathom that. So, I look back at that time now, in the late noughties when I was speaking to him. I was only a young guy myself. I was mid-20s. I didn't know that much about addiction. I know a lot more now. Could I have done anything differently? Could I have helped in any way? Well, I'm not going to beat myself up about it, but, who knows? It's interesting to think some of the things that can be hidden from you. As many addicts would tell me, we're cunning. That's the one thing about addiction, is it makes you cunning. You think of so many clever ruses to either pretend that you're sober or to get the drug that you need. So I do think back to that time and look at it with different eyes now. But, I'm not going to beat myself up about it, because there's a happy ending. The good news is, he got sober again and he's writing again. That's the really good news. Red Sheet, Red Sheet, June 2026. That's the news that we're looking forward to. And in the meantime, if you want a classic novel about show business, addiction, just a great all-American melodrama, then read Valley of the Dolls. It inspired James Ellroy. It still inspires him to this day. It's one of the best-selling novels of all time. It's selling 1 million copies a month at its height. Think of how many people it inspired. Perhaps it'll inspire you too. Okay, thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, and I'll see you next week for another episode of Ellroy Reads. Okay, thanks so much. Bye-bye.